Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the College Football Day-to-Day Show presented by Stats Perform. I am your host, Mike Leon. We're in the throes of it, Evan. Mid-November, baby, week 11 in the college football season. And we're going to break down everything happening in the college football playoff landscape. And all of the stats and insights are presented by the good folks, not only over at The Analyst, but Stats Perform's amazing new tool called PressBox Live. You can head to statsperform.com today to find out how college football teams, broadcasters, conferences are using this tool to help augment their game day coverage on Saturday. I alluded to him already. Joining me, as always, to break down the college football landscape, this man is the Charles Barkley to my Shaquille O'Neal, a data scientist over at Stats Perform and a college football writer on The Analyst, Mr. Evan Boyd. Evan, back-to-back power forward references for you as we are a tandem here.
Yes, I do love that. Although Charles Barkley, fun fact, does have the lowest 3-point percentage in NBA history. So, it's good to be compared to one of the greatest power forwards, but he does have that on his skills. And as a Bulls fan, I do take it with some slight discretion, I guess. But still, they did make the finals in '93 at least. But John Paxson,
that's true. Stats and insights in another sport, folks. Stats and insights. That's how talented this man is.
Yeah, that just.
Right off the top of the head. I love it.
I'm filled with it, unfortunately. Fortunately.
Well, let's get into stats and insights that you are filled with on the college football front, because phenomenal transition, if I may. The college football new rankings came out. Huge shakeup. We talked about on the last episode the matchup of the century, which kind of was a little bit of a dud for most of that game. What can you do, right? Georgia and Tennessee, obviously, we saw what happened down in Athens. The Bulldogs winning that game and now becoming the number one team according to the College Football Playoff Committee. The rankings shaking out: Georgia, Ohio State, and Michigan would be the 2-3 matchup right now if the season ended today. TCU in the 4 spot. Tennessee moving to 5th. We're going to get into that in a second. Oregon at 6, LSU and USC rounding out the top 8. Remember, the College Football Playoff expands in the coming years to an 8-team playoff. But give me some of your initial impressions, Evan, on the new rankings right now after what happened last week. Alabama losing at LSU, and obviously what happened with Georgia and Tennessee.
Yeah, I have no problem with it, really. You make the argument that maybe TCU can be 3rd and Michigan 4th, but overall, I think it's an accurate assessment of how these top 4 teams should be, and having Tennessee at the 5 spot is exactly where they should be. They should be looking out right now after losing to Georgia, and Georgia does seem like they're the number one. You can make the argument for Ohio State being number one, I guess, but it looks clear that we have the 4 teams that are ready to go for the college football playoff. I did actually just come up with a little bit of a metric to help us assess which teams would be the best candidates for the college football playoff. You can find that on The Analyst along with the other tracer, the team rating adjusted for conference and roster that we have at Stats. And it has actually 6 teams that I think could be a good playoff candidate. So it's not looking at, the probability of, these teams making the playoff, but rather what teams would be best suited if they were to make the playoff. And these are the 6 teams that I have. So it's the 4 teams that are already in the top 4: Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, and TCU. Those teams are undefeated. It also has Tennessee, and it actually has Alabama still there as a possible team to go out. But Alabama has a lot to work on. But what it does is kind of looks at how their schedule does and takes any really good team, let's say like Michigan or Alabama maybe, and it runs through their schedule. It simulates the schedule and sees if it can replicate the record that the team currently has. So, for example, if Michigan went through Alabama's schedule this year, what are the chances that they finish 7-2 or better? The answer, according to Tracer, is actually not that much. It's kind of surprising that they wouldn't be able to get there. So that's why it has Alabama as a possible being the first 2-loss team to make it. But they still have a lot to go. They would need to win the SEC West and need to make it to the SEC Championship and win out there. That seems unlikely right now. And Georgia still is a better team, and they're going to probably play in the SEC Championship. But Tracer does think that if everything goes well for Alabama, they still have a good chance. Why not LSU? Well, they are favorites to win the SEC West, but there's still a gap between the Tigers and Georgia. And the Georgia would be heavily favored in that one. And so unless the Tigers did win that, they would be a 3-loss team then, and they're out there. Why not someone like Clemson? Well, as we predicted last week, we thought Notre Dame was going to upset Clemson. They did. And Clemson really has not been great in terms of overall efficiency, which is what Tracer really looks for. So despite the fact that they're 8-1, they really had some luck wins, beating Wake Forest, beating Syracuse. If they lose one of those games, I think it's pretty clear that we're not even talking about Clemson in the playoffs. So I think that those 6 teams, with the weird exception of Alabama, are really going to be it. But we're going to talk about TCU, we're going to talk about Alabama, and we'll see, if those teams are going to be the Final Four, or if we're going to have what currently is the top 4 in the playoff.
Well, that's a perfect segue because, there's not that many games with a lot of juice on Saturday's schedule. Georgia obviously goes to Mississippi State. You were mentioning about LSU. 2 of their last 3 games are on the road at Arkansas and at Texas A&M. So in order for them to be able to jump a 1-loss team or some of the undefeateds in front of them, it's going to take a lot for LSU. And then obviously they would play Georgia in the championship game if all things stood even right now. But Ohio State plays Indiana this weekend. Again, the Hoosiers have not been that competitive as of late in some games, and Ohio State has been steamrolling the bottom half of the Big Ten East. So let's move into some matchups that we can actually look at and say, these are pretty good matchups and still have a potential implication on the college football playoff. One of them is the team you just alluded to in Alabama. They head to the Grove to take on Ole Miss, as Lane Kiffin is now 0-3 against Alabama as the Rebels head coach, while Nick Saban is 13-2 against Ole Miss as Alabama head coach. Evan, the Crimson Tide are reeling here. First time with 2 losses before the Iron Bowl since 2010, a stat and insight presented by Pressbox Live. So this is kind of unfamiliar territory for the Crimson Tide. What do you expect in Saturday's matchup here?
Well, first, I just talked hype about Alabama, but if they lose this game, they're obviously done. They're not making the playoff. And I really like what Lane Kiffin has done for this Ole Miss team, and it seems like it's going to be one of the best seasons they've had in quite some time. But Alabama has not lost back-to-back games since 2013, and both the Tide's losses have come at pretty much the last second. Remember, it was a game-winning field goal against Tennessee, as well as a game-winning 2-point conversion, very risky for LSU that they pulled that off. But if that just goes the other way, talking about Alabama still being a 1-loss team and one of the best in the FBS. So I think that Tennessee and LSU, the teams that Alabama lost to, are better than Ole Miss, but this is still an upset possibility. Ole Miss is 8-1, but I've seen signs of some concern over the last 2 games. Right, they were crushed by LSU 3 weeks ago. They were down at half to Texas A&M in their last game. They're coming off of a bye week. That could help. But I think Bryce Young is going to be too much for an Ole Miss defense that allowed over 300 pass yards to Texas A&M. The Aggies' offense is just okay this year. It's going to be the team's toughest matchup by far. And I think Nick Saban is going to really whip his players into shape to avoid a second consecutive loss, And overall, Tracer, it's really not loved Ole Miss this season. It's kind of like Clemson. They've had a lot of close wins going in there, so maybe 8-1's not the best way we see it, but Alabama has an 84% chance of winning this game, even if it's on the road. So it doesn't mean that it's impossible, right? We've seen different matchups before. Probabilities, that's what it suggested, but easily could be an upset. But I still think I'm going to go with Alabama on this one, and it's kind of going to be let's see how they can respond after a loss once again. So don't think it's going to be back-to-back losses for the Tide.
I agree with you. Even though the Rebels are 9th nationally in third down offense, Alabama's been averaging about 466 yards against Ole Miss under Nick Saban, and they've surpassed 600 yards in 3 games. I just think the Crimson Tide right now, too much right now. They know they can't afford a mistake. We said this last week, and we were almost right, if not for a 2-point conversion in overtime. Give me the Crimson Tide winning down there in Ole Miss. Let's move to a few more games because there's a couple of teams that are right on that fringe of potentially cracking the top 4. When we were on last week, we talked about, hey, here's Michigan sitting right in the 5th spot. All they got to do is have somebody in front of them lose, and 2 of those teams happen to play each other, and they moved up. Well, here's the same scenario with Oregon. They take on Washington, who's 7-2 right now. Washington has won its last 3 games after a quick 2-game skid during the middle of the season, and they're looking to make a run at the league title. Pretty big game, nighttime in Eugene. Washington and Oregon. Michael Penix Jr., the former Indiana transfer, has been leading the Huskies. Oregon, Bo Nix, the former Auburn transfer up there in Oregon, a lot in this game. Oregon is sitting right there at 6. They know TCU's got a tough game this weekend. We're going to get to TCU in a second. They know Ohio State and Michigan are going to end up playing each other. And they know Georgia still has a bunch of opportunities to fall in the SEC and maybe in the SEC championship. So they're sitting right there with one loss and another Pac-12 team with one loss, a couple spots behind them. What do you make of Saturday night's matchup up in Eugene?
You alluded right to it. I love this matchup for the quarterbacks, right? I think this is going to be a really fun game. If Oregon comes out, I think they have a really good chance maybe not really good chance, but their consideration into the playoff is more and more likely. Remember that they were crushed by Georgia early at the start of the season, and that really, I think, set everyone off against Oregon possibly making the playoff. But they've played great football since. Washington wins this game, I think, not that neither team is going to be considered for the playoff. But overall, I love this matchup for the quarterback comparison, right? We both have transfers that had some significant games before, now coming in as seniors. And remember, these games were awesome, right? Both these players know how to work in the clutch. Remember the Penix stretch against Penn State when he was at Indiana. Oh, I love that game. It was so fun. But let's talk about Michael Penix. He leads the FBS in pass yards per game, and they really rely on him. He's averaging 43 to 44 pass attempts per game. He can get it done with his feet. He can get it done with the pass, and he's really led to some significant wins for Washington this season. He's been the main reason. As for Bo Nix, he's second in the FBS in completion percentage. He's been fantastic over his last 4 games, completing about 80% of his passes. He's averaging over 11 yards per attempt. And if you like passer rating, his rating has been just under 200 in his last 4 games. He's been fantastic efficiently. He's turned into one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the FBS. And I don't think a lot of teams expected, or a lot of people expected that, especially after the loss to Oregon. But he's also stepped up his running game. He has 13 rushing touchdowns this year. That leads all FBS quarterbacks. And he's gotten more creative with the ball. Last week, we saw a trick play where Nix caught a touchdown pass. Credit to Dan Lanning for allowing this creativity for Bo Nix and this offense. I think it's really significant, and I think it's going to catch Washington by surprise a little bit. So I am going to trust Oregon's creativity with the ball. I think this is going to be a fun game, or maybe even a shootout. And Tracer agrees with me. They have Oregon winning this about 78% of the time. So I'm going to go with the Ducks here. And I think this will be a great one. And it's going to be even better because it's at a reasonable time. People in the Central Time and the Eastern Time can watch it. It's not Pac-12 after dark. So I'm looking forward to watching this one and not falling asleep going into the third quarter.
I've alluded to Pac-12 after dark a bunch. I love watching the Pac-12. So yeah, 7:00 game, 4:00 start up there in Eugene. Oregon has been averaging about 48 points per game at home. They've beaten the likes of BYU, 9th-ranked UCLA. They've beaten Stanford at home, Eastern Washington. Maybe they haven't played anybody to the competition level other than UCLA that Washington offers in terms of talent-wise. But this is going to be interesting for Oregon. They got 2 straight home games here and then the Civil War up in Corvallis when they had to take on Oregon State. 3 teams to close out their schedule, all with winning records, 2 of them in the college football top 25, and potentially then a Pac-12 championship game. Oregon sitting right there, everything to play for, and they could represent the Pac-12 conference in the college football playoff. But first, they got to get through Washington. I think they win this game. Not pretty easily, but I think the tradition continues of scoring at least 30, 35 points plus. Give me the over in this game, and I like the Ducks to win it up in Eugene. Let's move over. Let's go down south a little bit because the college football world is going to descend in Texas this Saturday. You've been on Texas and the Longhorns all season long, as has Tracer, and they take on the fourth ranked and 9-0 TCU Horned Frogs. Saturday night primetime game, as ABC will be airing this game between TCU and Texas. I'm going to get into a stat and insight in a second on the matchup. But last week, TCU looked a little sluggish, a little bit against Texas Tech in the first half, fourth quarter there. A couple touchdowns towards the end of the game made this look a little bit more out of reach than it actually was. It was a really close game. Texas Tech, obviously a 4-5 team right now after that loss, but they held their own with TCU, and now TCU is heading over to Texas. We've seen how Texas has played at home this year. Some of the close losses that they've had, they've been in every single game. They could easily be 9-0. What are you expecting from this matchup between these two Big 12 schools?
Yeah, so I mentioned briefly how TCU is up there as a playoff candidate, but not as strong as others. That is because of this game right here. So it's the toughest test for TCU. So although they're defeated, they really got to get through this game if they really want to make the playoff. I think if they lose this game, they still have a chance for the Big 12 championship game. But I think even if they lose this game, it's going to be really hard for them to get into the playoff because I think Michigan is going to be the most likely one-loss team, or Ohio State if Michigan does win. But each of the Horned Frogs' last 5 games have been decided by 10 or fewer points. These have been against good teams, mind you, and it's quality wins that they've had. Teams like Kansas State, Oklahoma State, even Kansas. Remember, Kansas was doing so well. That was a tough game to win on the road. But Texas on the road will be their biggest test by far. Texas is also as its close games. Those last road win against Kansas State wasn't as big as we thought. But in terms of efficiency, as you mentioned before, Tracer really loves the Longhorns. They're a top 10 team in the FBS. Tracer ranks them 7th in the FBS. Now, TCU is 10th, and that's not much of a gap between those two teams in terms of overall level. So, the home field advantage might be significant here for the Longhorns. And I think it's going to come down to 2 players, one on each side. TCU's Quentin Johnson and Texas's Bijan Robinson. Johnson, has been really good lately. He caught a touchdown pass in 4 straight games. He really went off against Kansas a while back. He's only had a few receptions now and then, but if Texas cannot help their defense, if they have a number 1 cornerback that cannot guard against Johnson, that's going to be a problem for them. Texas has struggled a little with covering a team's top receiver. If you recall, earlier in the season, Iowa State Xavier Hutchinson had over 150 receiving yards. If that happens again, this time for Johnson, the Doug and Johnson combo is going to be lethal for Texas. On the other hand, they have Bijan Robinson, who's played his best football all season. He just had a 200-yard rushing game. He's had over 100 yards for the most of the season in each game. I think he can easily do that again against this TCU defense. TCU's defense is okay in terms of the run. It's about middle of the pack, I would say. This is going to be its toughest test with Robinson. So I think Bijan Robinson is going to run all over him. I think Johnson's going to have maybe a really long touchdown reception. I think that this will be a shootout. I think Texas, I'm going to go Texas, prevailing over TCU here and causing a big stir for the playoff. Tracer favors Texas in this one at about 67%. That's mostly because they're slightly better in Tracer, but also have that home field. I'm going to go with the Longhorns here.
You know what? I may be on that same bandwagon. Let me give you a stat insight presented by PressBox Live. You head to statsperform.com today to find out more about PressBox Live and how teams, the leagues, and conferences are utilizing PressBox Live to augment their game day coverage on Saturday. You mentioned about TCU's last couple of games. Well, the last 3 meetings between Texas and TCU have been decided by 10 points or less, and an average total between the teams in that stretch is 62.7 points per game. Texas is 3-1 all time in the series when both teams are ranked. However, this is a good stat. Duggan's 4th start against Texas. He's currently 2-1 against the Longhorns. I just didn't like the way Max Duggan looked last week, especially in the first half. Texas Tech was getting a lot of pressure on him. I don't know how that will translate over on the road. If you just look at the common opponents that they've played so far, Texas has fared a lot better in the common opponents than TCU has. It's on the road. If it was at TCU, maybe I'd feel a little bit different if it was in Fort Worth. Because it's in Austin, I like the Longhorns in this game. I'm going to go with you as well and take Texas. And again, you've been saying it all year. Texas is a team, again, 3 losses, but they were right there in those 3 losses and could easily be 9-0 or 8-1 and sitting outside, the bubble of the top 4 in the college football playoff. Let's get into our last matchup before we sign off for the audience here, because I thought this was an interesting game that kind of got circled here. We've been talking about the ACC and the good football that's been played so far in that conference. Clemson, obviously, big upset loss to a pseudo ACC team in Notre Dame, but you have NC State, you have Wake Forest, you have North Carolina, all these schools that have been playing good football and have been living in the top 25 universe. Well, here's a matchup between UNC as they head to take on the Demon Deacons of Wake Forest. UNC is sitting there 8-1. They only have 1 loss to Notre Dame at home. And Mac Brown has a resurgence here at North Carolina, a high scoring offense. The defense is but it's winning them games, right? And now they head to 6-3 at Dave Clawson's Wake Forest squad. Again, another year for Wake Forest where they easily could be another team that's like an 8-1, 9-0, and you could be talking about the ACC having a conversation to be able to put at least one or maybe two teams into the college football playoff. Hasn't shaken out like that because they've been beating up on each other. But what do you make of this matchup in North Carolina there between UNC and Wake Forest?
Yeah, you mentioned the North Carolina defense. I remember that App State game earlier this year. That was quite a fun ride. But it really, I think it's going to come down once again, as we were mentioning with Oregon and Washington. I think it's going to come down to a QB battle yet again here. Drake May, I think, could secure a top 3 Heisman spot if he wins this game. I think a lot of people think he might be there already, but I think he could secure it if he does really well here against Wake Forest. He has 31 touchdown passes and only 3 picks on the season, and he's been consistent for pretty much all season. He had a 2-pick game earlier, but that was really about it. Even in North Carolina's 1 loss this season, he threw for 5 touchdown passes. He's been really good. And of North Carolina's last 4 games, though, 3 have been decided by a field goal. Tar Heels have 4 wins decided by 3 or fewer points this year. That's the most in the FBS. So talk about close games that they've had to handle. They could, we were talking about Texas possibly being an 8-1 team. UNC could very much be a 6-3 team, I would say here. But what I don't like about Wake Forest is about their quarterback, Sam Hartman. He's been careless with the ball. Talk about Drake May having 3 interceptions on the season. Well, Sam Hartman has had back-to-back games with 3 interceptions, okay? So he threw 3 picks against NC State last week, 2 of which led to field goals. So these are really costing Wake Forest. We talked to him about last week about how he had to be careful. He wasn't, right? So I don't think he's going to really recover. I think, even though North Carolina doesn't have as good of a pass defense, I think it'd be enough. Maybe Hartman can rebound, but I don't think it's going to be, too much for North Carolina to handle despite their defense issues. If Sam Hartman isn't doing that well, like he hasn't really for the last 2 games, it's going to spell trouble for Wake Forest once again. So I'm going to go with North Carolina here. Tracer actually likes this game for Wake Forest. In terms of Tracer, both teams are actually about the same. And Tracer likes it because Wake Forest has home field advantage, but it's really small. It's like 58% chance in favor of the Demon Deacons. I will go North Carolina in this, though. I think they're playing better football right now, and I think they can get a road win here.
Yeah, I'm with you. I like North Carolina a lot. They're 5th in the NCAA in scoring touchdowns, 48. They're averaging close to 500 yards per game. The offense has been prolific. I mentioned they have 1 loss, and it's at home. It's not on the road when they lost that game to Notre Dame. Wake Forest, sometimes at home, doesn't have the full home crowd behind them. All you got to do is turn on the tape of that Clemson-Wake Forest game and see how many Clemson fans made the journey from South Carolina. I think UNC fans will dominate the attendance, maybe a 60-40 type of split. Wow. Give me the Tar Heels winning that game. Again, if North Carolina wins out, they will be in the ACC championship game. So that's something huge for Tar Heel fans. And Mac Brown, the job that he's done there since he retired and then went back, obviously to call games for ESPN. And now he's come out of retirement, and what he's done with UNC and been able to build that program. You mentioned Drake May. He's been phenomenal this year. Again, 5th in passing yards, close to 3,000 yards passing. He's 3rd in the nation in QBR, close to 90%. So give me the Tar Heels. I'll take the Tar Heels over Sam Hartman's turnover propensity, let's call it, for lack of a better term. My thank yous to Evan Boyd, a data scientist over at Stats Perform, and also a contributor over on The Analyst. You want to check out all those stats and insights that he mentioned from Tracer's rankings. Check it out over on theanalyst.com. All the stats and insights are provided also by PressBox Live. You can head to statsperform.com today to find out how teams, conferences, broadcasters, everybody's using PressBox Live to help augment their game day coverage on Saturdays. We'll be back in a couple weeks with another installment. We're going to look at the Heisman Trophy. We're going to get deeper into November, Evan. We're almost there. Bowl season will be upon us. Everything will start to shake out. Conference, who's going to be playing in these conference matchups between, in the championships between the ACC, the Pac-12, the Big Ten. All of this stuff is going to shake out. We will be back in a few weeks with a brand new episode. For Evan Boyd, I'm Mike Leon. Thank you so much for watching and listening to College Football Day to Day over on The Analyst.